In this lesson, we talk about reading configuration settings efficiently. The objectives of this lesson are to add settings to our app settings file, retrieve the settings, we'll put those settings into a class properties one at a time, and then we will assign JSON settings directly to the properties of the class. Where you put your configuration settings is completely up to you. We have a lot of configuration provider options though. Obviously, JSON files in the app settings, we have environment variables, Azure Key Vault or app configuration, command line arguments, in-memory .NET objects, and even your own custom providers, so you could store them wherever you want. A lot of built-in providers that we can take advantage of to get settings from wherever they're located. We're going to use the most common approach, and that is using the appsettings.json files. There's two files, appsettings.json, appsettings.development.json. Obviously, one is for production mode, one is for development mode, and the values are taken from whichever file depending on the mode in which you are running. So we're going to add some settings to our configuration file. So in our appsettings.development.json, we'll add a new JSON object to hold a default informational message. Remember the informational message where we said problem attempting to get from the product API, please contact your system administrator? We're going to take that hard-coded message out of the product controller and we're going to put it here into our configuration file. We're then going to pass in a configuration object that's created by ASP.NET into the product controller so that we can read that data out of that file. Now this is the built-in one that ASP.NET automatically configures for you, and it allows us then to return the information by reading from a variable. We're going to call it _config, and we do _config, and then in square brackets and in quotes, we actually specify the path to get to that property. And the path in this case is going to be ADVWorks API :info message default. Let's start out just adding some configuration settings, injecting a configuration object into a new controller, and then learning how to read settings individually. Open up the appsettings.development.json, and we're going to add an AdventureWorks API property. The value for that property is going to be another object, and that object has a property called info message default, and the value for that is problem attempting to some sort of verb like get, put, or post. These are just replaceable tokens that I'm going to use. Using the class name, please contact your system administrator. So pretty darn simple. Let's go ahead and just save that. Now let's create a new class under controllers. So we'll add a new class here. We're going to call it config test controller. And the code we're going to insert into here is going to be this. It's a new controller. So we have our route, we have our API controller, we inherit from our controller base API. We have a private read-only IConfiguration. So _config, and we're going to make sure we add that then into our constructor so that we can have that injected for us. And again, this is the built-in one for .NET. It knows how to read from this appsettings.json file. And then just like I had in the slides, look down here, I've got a route, and it's our IConfiguration test, where I'm going to simply return _config ADVWorks API :info message default. So it's going to that first object, then going to that property info message default, and returning the value. If we don't find anything, if it's null, I'm just going to return a string.empty. So there we go. Let's go ahead and save this. We'll run this. And if we've done everything correctly, when we execute this, we should see our message. Let's now add two more properties to our JSON object. Product category ID, product model ID. Now, if you remember our AdventureWorks API defaults class, remember, it already had the product category ID and the product model ID. We're now going to add an info message default property to that same class. We'll create an instance of that class and fill in now all three properties. So let's do that now. We'll add our new properties and then read those in to our default class from the JSON file. Open up the appsettings.development.json, add a comma, and then add our additional values here, product category ID, product model ID. Now go back to the entity layer and open up the AdventureWorks API defaults, and we'll create a new string called info message default. We'll take that value, and up here we'll go ahead and initialize that to string.empty. And now we have these three properties match the three properties here in our development.json file. So let's go back now to the config test controller, and let's add another route called set properties. So as you can see, we're still getting that configuration file in here, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new AdventureWorks API default settings class, and then within the constructor of that, I'm going to set all three of those properties by reading the values from the JSON file. Now, obviously, the category ID and the model ID I need to convert to an int32 because everything in the JSON file is string. So there we go. We've got that. Let's go ahead and try this out. So let's try our set properties route now. We'll click on that. So now you can see the values that we're getting, the info message default, product category ID, product model ID. Those are the values from the JSON file, not the hard-coded ones from the constructor. Now here's one of the great things that Microsoft did. If you create your JSON object with the same property names that match to your class, you don't need to read them individually like I just did. Instead, you can use the config.getRequired section, and you grab that AdventureWorks API, and it'll read all of those and get those values and put them into a new instance of the AdventureWorks API defaults. Let's take a look at assigning settings directly to a class. Open up the config test controller and let's add another route, this one called assign to class. So now I'm not creating a new instance of the AdventureWorks API defaults. I'm going to let this method that's a part of the configuration class do it for me. So you can see here on line 25, settings equal _config.getRequired section. That's the AdventureWorks API, and then do a get, passing in the class name. It'll create a new instance. It'll map each property that matches to the properties in the class from the JSON file, and we then have our assignment. So if we then just return that, we'll be able to see the value here. So let's run this one, and what we get back now is that class, and you can see the values have been automatically mapped to each property. So as long as the property names match up, it's all good. Now for things like configuration settings, you might want to just read it one time. You may not want to inject it each time into each controller. You'd want to read the settings, put them into the AdventureWorks API defaults, and then inject that into each controller. So let's take a look at how to set that up in Program.cs. So open up your Program.cs, and now what we can do is we can create a new instance of our AdventureWorks API defaults. We can then do a builder.configuration.getSection AdventureWorks API, and this time we use the bind method to bind the values that we read in from that section directly to the properties in this instance of that class. Then we can do a builder.services.addSingleton on that AdventureWorks API defaults and pass in the instance of that class. That now becomes the class that's going to use throughout the whole application. So if we go back to the config test controller, what we can do up here is let's add now a private value. Let's go here and notice how it gives us the nice IntelliSense. So it's going to go ahead and do the injection for us, which is wonderful. And then what we can do is we're going to add another method called inject defaults. Now in this one, I'm going to show you how we get the settings. They're already there because they've been injected. So settings.infomessageDefault equals _settings.infomessageDefault.replace that replaceable parameter verb with get, and do a replace on the class name with product. So this is a sample here. We're going to put this into the product controller here in a minute, but let's go ahead and just make sure it works. Let's try out this latest API here and look at that. Now look at the info message default where it has problem attempting to get using the product API. So those replaceable parameters got done. Everything got injected correctly. Wonderful. Now the problem with reading those values in Program.cs and assigning them and binding them to that settings class is that's a one-time operation. So what we're going to do is we're going to use this tool called IOptionsMonitor. It's a generic that looks for changes to the JSON settings file, and then it will reread the data at runtime. So the next time that you inject the IOptionsMonitor, we can read the new values at that time. So let's take a look at using this IOptionsMonitor generic. So open up the Program.cs again, and this time we're going to do something a little bit differently. We're going to do builder.services.configure. We then pass in our class, AdventureWorks API defaults. And then we're going to pass it to the configuration section that it should watch. So now what's going to happen? We're going to go over to our product controller, and we're going to add in now our AdventureWorks API defaults. And we can let Visual Studio create this for us, but we're going to add on something a little different. What we're going to do now is we're going to do the IOptionsMonitor like so. And we're going to pass that in. But now we need a reference here. So we'll let it using Microsoft.extensions.options. And then notice it's saying, well, wait a minute, you have an IOptionsMonitor here. You don't have the AdventureWorks API default, which is what we're trying to assign. But that's right. We want to say dot current value because it's the current value that we're interested in getting. This means I'm monitoring that section. Go and get the current values right now at the time of this construction. Go ahead and use that. So now that's all fixed up. Now let's come down here to the catch block in our get. Because what we want to do is change this now to use that settings. We don't want the hard-coded value anymore, right? We want to go get the settings and then do that replace just like I showed you in the last little section there. So now we're going to replace the verb with get, the replace class name with product. Isn't that nice? So now we've got something very generic. We can change the default message in our app settings and we can run this. Actually, let's not run this yet. Let's go ahead and throw the exception just to make sure all of this works as we're expecting. So we'll throw the new application exception. So go down here to our product API. We'll try it out. We'll execute. We get the error. And there we go. Look at that. There's our replaceable parameters have come in. Our new message, it's all there. If we then go back here, we change this and save that. Okay, now let's go back to our API here. Oops, I didn't mean to close that. Let's go ahead and just do an execute again. And now look at that. You can see problem test. So it automatically picked up that change. In this lesson, we stored global settings into a JSON file. We then learned how to read those settings from the JSON file using an IConfiguration object. We mapped configuration settings directly to an object, and we used IOptionsMonitor for flexibility. Coming up next, formatting JSON and XML input and output.